controls as well as CFIUS and the other policy areas here, it seems to me that we're kind of in a different era, right? So the technology that we're seeking to control has more commercial application than some of the technologies that you referenced, Chris, during the Soviet, the Cold War era, propulsion technology, missile technology, AI, quantum. There are many commercial applications. And when you think about sort of the other countries that have those technologies or are leaders in developing those technologies, they may see an opportunity in getting their products to market and sort of winning the race against the United States by being able to access the China market and other markets. So what are the prospects of actually multilateralizing export controls in this era?
Well, I think the prospects are pretty good, actually, both in technology controls and in foreign investment reviews. I think that a preferred approach, in my view, to dealing with China would be to work with allies to deal with shared national security concerns. It's notable that allies have put in place new foreign investment review regimes just within the last few years. And I think many of them would be very willing to engage with the United States in a cooperative, even if you started with an information sharing process that's more robust than what we have today. In export controls, there is an existing regime called the Wassenaar Arrangement. I hope that whatever new technologies are proposed for control under the Commerce Reg, emerging and foundational, will be proposed to Wassenaar for multilateral control. I think it's essential that they must be. Is it going to be hard? Yes, it's hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is, unlike in the Soviet era, the target, in this case China, is also a leader in these technologies. The Chinese are leaders in artificial intelligence of a certain kind. The Chinese are very interested in quantum computing. Obviously, Huawei is a leader in 5G already, part of the issue. So it's not going to be as simple as it might have been when there was, a common Cold War adversary and a lot of consensus around how to deal with it. But I do think that's an essential element for any administration. And the same, by the way, is true for supply chain security. If we do come up with some great recipe on how to do better control of the ICT supply chain or the defense industrial-based supply chain, we ought to be discussing that with allies, particularly allies that we work with in a cooperative way on defense and intelligence. That is an area that, as I said, this administration has not really done any of that. And they've done other things in the trade area to antagonize allies. And the one area where they've tried to talk to allies is about Huawei, and it's case specific, and it's not been particularly effective. So I think that's an opportunity for this administration or a subsequent administration, and it's essential.
I'm going to ask a few more questions, and then I also want to invite the audience to ask questions as well. So please start thinking about what you'd like to pose to the panel. My next question, though, is for John, and for anyone else who wants to chime in. How is this sort of ongoing U.S.-China trade negotiation, you think, affecting sort of the executive order and the rollout of the rule? Because some people are saying, that the delay in getting the rollout is in part because, we want to use it as leverage in a trade negotiation. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Denise. Well, certainly heard the same rumors about whether there is a connection or not between the negotiations of the so-called Phase 1 deal and the delay in the implementing regulations. I think certainly the timing is coincidental. I don't know that I could comment more on whether it is in fact related. I do think that overall, certainly our perspective at ITI is that we shouldn't be conflating trade and national security in that way. I mean, again, there are obviously a lot of touch points. That's what we're talking about here today. But that's our position on that. That we shouldn't be conflating that or trading away national security as part of as part of the trade deal. I think.
So one thing that we haven't really discussed on this panel yet is innovation, right? So we're talking about export controls and investment restrictions to preserve U.S. technology know-how, but we're not talking about sort of affirmatively what the U.S. ought to be doing to make sure that our technology is the best and that we win in this innovation race. Do you think that's a problem? Should there be more focus on this? And what should we be doing for anyone who wants to take that?
Well, I mean, it sounds like everyone wants to chime in, but just to start, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think all of the policy tools we've been talking about today, to some extent or another, are about keeping quote unquote American technology here, or other technology or investment out, and certainly what we should be doing is trying to out-compete and out-innovate, and there's a lot of ways to do that. I mean, I think if you just look at the raw numbers, we're frankly not investing as much as some of our competitors, as a country. If we look back to corollaries earlier in history, such as the space race and the percentage of GDP that was invested compared to what we're investing now in these key emerging technologies like AI, 5G, and quantum, it's not even close. So I mean, I think certainly there should be more focus on that aspect of it.
Yeah, again, it's a great point and a great question. What I would say is, to date, the focus on these issues has been driven by an analytical formula that says there's threat, and so we need to build some greater mechanisms to put in place this separation of these walls to protect against that threat. But that's an incomplete framework, and the right framework would be, how do we take advantage of our own strengths and opportunities to promote them while also addressing risk. And if it were to be reframed that way, then it gets to the innovation point, because I think one of the things, and Chris probably can speak to this more effectively, is many of the great American technology leaders would say the most significant risk to innovation is the ability to have talent in the United States, and to be able to tap into that talent, not just in the United States, but also globally, and to reduce barriers to that so you can innovate, bring that back to the U.S. also if innovation doesn't occur here. And that's just one example. There could be other examples also. 5G is a great case study. We are behind in 5G. China has many advantages there. We're going out to allies and saying, you got to build this wall against Huawei. Well, it's very hard for them to accept that for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's not easy for them to replace Huawei. And a natural response would be, well, what are you, the United States, doing to invest and give us alternatives? Or how can we work with it together? Or what collaborative relationships could we have? And I think we do need to couple some of these defensive mechanisms with a broader strategy that focuses on creating that innovation, whether it's here or elsewhere in like-minded countries. And I think that that's totally missing right now.
I would strongly agree. The competitiveness angle is a missing angle. The Peace Parks the administration has an initiative called Industries of the Future. It's organized out of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. They've identified these technologies that they view as key. What they haven't done is put any money behind anything. It's basically a hortatory thing, which is welcome. I'm glad they're doing it. But take this example. The fastest supercomputer in the United States is at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. most of our fastest and best supercomputers are at the national labs, Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge, Argonne, etc. And they're used by the government to do a lot of different things, including simulated nuclear testing. But they also are involved in pharmaceutical research, they're made available to researchers and so forth. We've suggested that there should be a national network of quantum computers at the national laboratories, and that the government ought to spend, several $1 billion over the next few years to invest in that. And they can get them from us, they can get them from others, but the point is, we need to put some money behind investing in competitiveness. We know how to do this. We did it in the 1980s. We did it in semiconductor technology. We did it in supercomputers. I think the administration needs to look at that aspect of this as well, promote a promotional aspect instead of just a restrictive one.
At this point, let's take some questions from the audience. Ken, did you want to?
I might just jump in on that last point. I think in the realities of the 21st century economy require us, as Chris mentioned, to make sure that the aims that we're trying to do don't actually impact our own competitiveness, because foreign investment is making a tremendous amount of work in this space, and so using these tools to become some sort of way to escalate trade disputes or coerce market reciprocity, we need to ensure that we're focused on national security, but not use an old world mentality in terms of us versus them, when in fact the complexities of the 21st economy are much more important today.
Thank you. So we're going to take some questions, ask a few ground rules. While the mic runner comes to you, please identify yourself and your organization. And we follow what I call the Scott Miller rule. If you all know Scott from CFIUS, he says, can you please ask your question in the form of a question? So with that, we'll...
Here in the front. Good morning. Thanks for the excellent panel. I'm Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I wanted to drill in on this point about conflating national security with trade, and also the comment that this, about innovation. So the reduction of foreign direct investment by the Chinese is also, there's a kind of parallel corollary going on, which is the kind of crackdown on visas for Chinese scholars, researchers, and just people. A lot of Silicon Valley is populated with people who are coming from China or other parts of Asia, but specifically China, working on kind of innovative startup technologies that then get absorbed by companies like IBM. Can you talk about whether that part of it could change, if there is a change in the administration, or if that too is the sort of thing that will continue on?
It's a great question. I don't know whether that piece will change with a change in the administration. I think you're correct to identify it as a real issue. I mean, my own personal view is that is an example of where if the government redefined the issue set as not just what are the risks to U.S. national security, but more holistically, how do we enhance national security, which includes a broader set of considerations, then I think a fair perspective of that would be not to restrict as many visas and to try to attract that talent coming in. There is a need for it, not just in Silicon Valley, but elsewhere. And the reality is that many of the world's best engineers are going to not just be American, and they will be Chinese, they will be Indian, they will be from other countries in Asia and Europe and elsewhere. And we do want to have that talent, or we should want to have that talent in the U.S. I've heard the State Department cite statistics that suggest, in fact, we're not restricting visas in that fashion. And I can't speak to that one way or the other from a factual basis. I think the perception among many of the people we deal with in the private sector is it is harder to get in. And not only the perception in the United States, but more significant, the perception outside the United States of whether you also would be welcome here. And I think that is an issue that we will need to be addressing, whether it's this administration or another one going forward, because you do not want to have the circumstance where foreign persons who otherwise would find the U.S. as a very attractive place to study and work and contribute to our economy and the like, no longer want to come. And I do think that the reality is there's that perception that is out there.
Thank you. I'm Olivia Zhang with China's Taixing Media. My question goes to Chris with IBM. I just want to ask about IBM's current businesses. Huawei, how's the license application going? Like we've heard back in G20 in June that President Trump said he will allow to do business with Huawei's non-sensitive, national security business, but it still kept delaying that license. So I'm just wondering how to go and regarding our conversation with BIS. And also, what is your current business with Huawei? Because I know like if you have manufacturing overseas, I think you will still be able to supply to Huawei. So how does this entity listing really influence IBM's business with Huawei? Yeah, thank you.
We don't have very much business with Huawei. We didn't have very much business with Huawei before the entity listing. Most of what we did was consulting services, business consulting services. But once they were placed on the entity list, we had to suspend that work. Your last point, though, about mentioning that some companies, IBM is no longer in the chip business, but there are chip companies that have found that if they manufacture outside the United States and meet certain criteria, that they can continue shipping to Huawei, and some have said publicly that they are doing so. It raises an interesting point, which is the entity list is being used in a way it was never intended to be used. The administration was looking for a hammer. They stumbled on the entity list, and they made use of it extensively. If what they really had wanted to do was to stop all business with Huawei, what they would have done was to put them on this specially designated nationals list maintained by the Treasury Department, which really is a death penalty, which really would prevent any transactions with Huawei, including those done offshore with foreign-based technology and so forth. They didn't do that. Why? Because that list is maintained by the Treasury. The Treasury didn't think it was maybe such a good idea. I'm speculating. But if what they had wanted to do was really give the death penalty to Huawei, that would have been the list they would have used. The fact that they didn't use it and that it's maintained by Treasury, which has taken generally a different view on the overall trade war than maybe other agencies, tells me something. And what it indicates to me is that the Commerce Department found this nice hammer and offered it up to the White House, and the White House said, great, hit him. And how we get out of that now, I don't have the slightest idea. And so I don't know where BIS is on any licenses. Couldn't speculate on whether or when they might issue them. Maybe John knows.
I don't.
There you go.
Any other questions from the audience? In the back over there.
Thank you, panels. This has been fascinating, and I'm Joel Roberts with Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Chris, great to hear you talk about supercomputers at Oak Ridge, and we're looking forward to delivering the new fastest supercomputer in the world at Oak Ridge sometime in 2021. My question goes back to the topic of multilateralism. For those countries that may be aligned with US foreign policy interests, sort of Five Eyes those countries, but don't have the economic clout to completely cast off Chinese investment in collaboration with China, what are the levers that the US government can pull with these governments, the foreign governments, to ensure the sort of multilateral approach that you were suggesting?
Well, I can take that from the investment perspective. So I I think Chris actually articulated it correctly, which is there is an appetite there for multilateralism. The issue that the U.S. is confronting with our allies is not that they see the world differently inherently, or that they don't share a common concern. There are a couple of issues. One, they're just differently situated. And so they have to grapple with that concern in a way that fits with where they sit in the world. And then the second, which doesn't have to be an issue, is how they're perceiving what levers we do have or not. So one way to approach it would be to say, and I think this is actually, I think CFIUS in particular, the CFIUS agencies and the folks who sit on the committee who are working with the allies are approaching it in this fashion, which is, we're not going to tell you exactly what you have to do. We're going to educate you. Here are some core principles. You want to have accountability. You want to have professionalism. You want to be able to review things. There's mitigation mechanisms. It's not that you have to stop everything. So there are some principles, and there's an education process that's going on. I think that is helpful. What I think has probably been less helpful is outside of that, and in particular in the Huawei context, I think the dialogue has been, we have leverage over you, and if you do not do what we want, we're going to exercise that leverage. And I think the reality is, in many of these allies, while they would see the issue set similarly and be appreciative of the education and the dialogue that's occurring on the foreign investment screening side, they don't really appreciate being threatened. And that may also have an impact in their level of appetite to adopt some of the similar mechanisms that we would want. So I don't think it's that we actually have to exercise leverage. I think if you approach it from one of the advantages that we do have, which is we have allies, and treat them as allies, and recognize where they sit and work with them on some of these issues, they are going to be very receptive.
Yeah, I mean, just to,
You wanted to say something, Dave?
yeah, no, I just wanted to add, on the multilateral point, there has been some, the U.S. government has been involved in some multilateral efforts, particularly with respect to 5G security. There's so-called Prague principles that were issued not too long ago, and while the principles were fairly high level, it is significant that 40 some odd countries agreed to them. So I mean, there are some efforts underway to address some of the 5G security and supply chain efforts in that regard, mostly involving European countries and then other countries like Australia and Israel and Japan and others. And then I guess the one other thing I wanted to say is that I think a lot of our foreign partners are looking at some of these issues similarly, but just reaching different conclusions. I think some of the key questions are, for instance, in the context of what we were talking about earlier, what is the whether certain ICT products and services are critical, and how do you evaluate the so-called criticality. Really importantly, a lot of people are talking about the trustworthiness of potential suppliers and components. There are lots of different indicia of trustworthiness, and not everyone is using the same set of indicators. And then also, I think everyone can agree there are legitimate risks and threats out there in the global environment in this context. But there's a key question as to whether or not those threats are mitigatable or not. And again, there are differences of opinion depending on which countries you're talking to. So it really is important that countries talk together and get on the same page, I think, on a lot of these issues.
Thanks. Just one final point on that. I think if you look at the Furman bill, that was definitely the intent of Congress to formalize the sharing of information. I think it's definitely incumbent upon the government to articulate what the threat is and shared knowledge, specific knowledge about what the threat is, so that it can be addressed, not just to rely on companies or other entities to make that assessment on their own, but to really articulate what the threat is so that it can be addressed directly.
I think I saw a hand raised over here in this area. Oh, there, back there, please.
Hi, Jen Riccardi from the European Union. I want to say that indeed many allies do share those same concerns and have a strong interest in finding a multilateral way forward. And to that end, I have two questions for the panel. First, does the panel have an opinion on whether the U.S. is doing enough working with multilateral partners on the question of how to define emerging and foundational now before we get to the stage of moving on to export controls? And secondly, do existing multilateral structures like VASNAR, are they agile enough to deal with fast-moving emerging technologies? Thanks.